Good morning. Good morning. Good afternoon. Hello? Okay, why is this not working out? Let me check it out. Hello and welcome to The Outsiders number 8, which is going to be about my life searching for freedom, a little bit more of my story, and the Constitution of the United States. Now, I'll start with the first topic. As you remember in my history, I went from a boy who was somehow frustrated in his teenage years with the amount of power that the federal government wanted to have over me, including assigning me a social security number and telling me I had to apply for a selective service to go die in the draft if they so chose. That was the first couple things that happened. And then just noticing how power was focused through the educational system that I was going through. And in fact, I only lasted through 2 years of college because of the nonsense that I saw there. I realized that, well, to be honest, I realized that, like Louis L'Amour, I had to leave schooling at some point because it was interfering with my education. My only problem was I did it when I was 21 instead of 15 like Louis L'Amour did, and thus I haven't written as many novels that were successful as he did. So that was my mistake. Yes, he says I was compelled to leave formal schooling at the age of 15. One was because I was under the necessity of earning out a meager living by my daily labor, and second and more importantly was because it was interfering with my education. And Louis was a big reader, as most authors and a lot of creative people are. So he went off and read and then eventually wrote some of the greatest cowboy novels in American history. Okay, but enough about him, more back to me. So I went through the 2 years of college, and then I had to decide how to move forward. And I ended up getting married in Germany, and that in itself is a whole different story for a whole different podcast. But after I was married, after I was in Germany, I was still possessed with these ideas that we needed to have freedom in some way, and I needed to contribute toward freedom, and I didn't know how. And so what I did, I met a friend on Yahoo Groups back when there was, well, actually it was e-groups is what it was called originally, and then it became Yahoo Groups after Yahoo bought them and ran them into the ground after that, which happened to so many internet companies, by the way. At the beginning of, say, 99, 98, 2000, it was funny. I went on my mission to Germany in 1995, and there was no such thing as the internet. And I have stories about that. But I got back, and the internet was everywhere. And so once that happened, we started connecting quite organically and without the power of the state or finances or advertising in the middle. In fact, some people wanted to outlaw advertising on the internet to keep it this pure platform for the dissemination of ideas. And I don't know if that might have been a good idea, seeing how the whole thing has been captured now and controlled, and people are kept in these thin lanes on about 4 websites. You don't know what the internet was like in 2000 if you didn't experience it. And I mean, I was 19, 20, 21. 21, I got home and the internet was everywhere. So we started connecting. I connected to another gentleman named Ryan, and we created a website and an email list. And the website and the email list was based upon the concept of the freeman, which if you've read the Book of Mormon, there is a gentleman named Moroni, and he does some very powerful things to get people to take freedom seriously. He takes his coat and tears it off and writes on it in memory of our wives and our families and our freedom, and he hangs this up, and he has this title of liberty, and this is this sort of flag to sort of, you know, gather people for freedom. And he gathers people to go fight the people who are taking away people's freedom. So anyway, and so they called themselves the Freemen, and I thought, well, what am I? Who am I? You know, politically, and that seemed like a better title than anything else. Let's call ourselves the Freemen. So what did we do in terms of freedom? Well, sitting there at, you know, the age in our early 20s, we thought, well, let's put out a quote every day about freedom. So we started a mailing list, and we used to mail people quotes every day talking about freedom. And so we'd find quotes about freedom, political freedom, human freedom, considering that I think it is the fundamental struggle of humanity at this moment. In fact, some of us have been taught that the difference between the plans of the divine and the evil is freedom. One side, even if it says it has good results, wants to take away everyone's freedom. And the other side says even if people do the wrong thing, they need to have freedom in order to live and exist. And you can see this in the political systems of the world right now. You have systems that are ostensibly based on freedom, which you see is being challenged at this very moment. And you have systems that pretty much tell people what to do. And if they get out of line, they're punished and or killed. And those are command and controlled structured societies. And so far, none of them has lasted very long in terms of more than 100 years since 1900, when, just using that as a benchmark, when a lot of these systems have gotten implemented in large scale over big quantities of people. All right. So that said, I was on this Freeman mailing list, and I was mailing out a quote every day. Here I would, what do you call it? Queue up quotes so that they were sent out every day automatically without anything that we had to do. And the funny thing was, you would think sending out a quote every day about freedom that you would run out in a brief amount of time. Well, no, it became so easy to have tons and tons. I mean, 365 a year, no problem. Like, there were thousands and thousands of great quotes about freedom and that existed, and we started to educate people. So we'd provide them this little quote and some education, and tried to do some other stuff, but basically it settled down to this quote. And as a process of that, of trying to educate people about freedom and liberty, what I ended up doing, we ended up trying to glean from all these sources where you could read about freedom and liberty. And so what I did, among other things, is I read the Federalist Papers, 80, 85, kind of depending on who you ask there. And I went through each Federalist paper, printed them all out on my printer. So I had this stack of notebooks with each Federalist paper in them. And I went through and highlighted them, then I copied and pasted the quotes. And if you don't know what the Federalist Papers are the arguments for ratifying the Constitution with the states. Yeah, that's really what it is. They're trying to convince people that we want a strong federal government, that if we don't have a strong federal government, we're going to fall apart. Again, these people had just gotten out of the tyranny of King George. At least that was the narrative that was sold. And they had their loose association of states. And then according to those in power, that really wasn't working, and they needed more power and more the more focus of power in a certain location and a federal government, a strong federal government which had power over the states. And that was basically, you have to understand that every state, yeah, they used to have the Confederacy, right? Right. Anyway, I think that's what it's called. So they used to have this Confederacy of states, and you have to understand each state in the United States was its own government, is its own government, even today. Like when I go to Germany and you are getting things done and you switch driver's licenses and things, it all depends on which state you're dealing with, because the federal government has certain responsibilities, but each state is basically its own nation, with the caveat that they can't establish tariffs between states in the United States and a lot of other things, so that theoretically trade flows freely and that people have equal chances in most of the states, and that there's kind of and you've seen this happen now, maybe for the first time in such an intense way since the Civil War and civil rights struggles. You've seen that people are going to states where they value freedom more, or where they see their freedom is more protected, and people are going away from states where they feel like they don't have choices. And so that was all kind of the questions of the Constitutional Convention. Now, I want to read to you a little bit about the Constitution before I get into the Federalist Papers, just from Wikipedia, so not even very... I am tired today. Not even controversial stuff, right? Just from Wikipedia. And I'm going to tell you a few other things that you may or may not know, which will involve research. As I began researching for today to even begin to talk about this topic, it became obvious in very fast, became quickly obvious that trying to talk about the Constitution in any depth at all would take way too much time and way too much research, and it would go into depths that are very, very challenging to figure out and discover. But there are people who have written books about it. There are people who have done the research about it. Like I said, I recommend the Bad Quaker podcast to talk about it. And you can start going down these rabbit holes, which if you avoid completely the brainwashing, now the entire first pages of Google is all brainwashing, disinformation, misinformation, all the things, fake news, everything that they blame the others for doing, now they are doing. And that wasn't so for some time. You could actually find useful, valuable information on Google a decade ago or longer. And now you really can't. So all these alternative viewpoints, they push them all into the realm of, well, that's a conspiracy theory. And they use that as a type of thought stop. Thought stop, in other words, whenever you hear something and someone says conspiracy theory, you see a big red sign that pops up in your brain, and it says, don't go down this path, because if you go down this path and you think these thoughts and you move in this direction, you're going to be off of the status quo. You will not belong to us in regular society. You will be in danger, right? And so most people wanting to belong and to be a part of the status quo and to go along to get along will simply abandon that thought and drop it. And instead of going down that rabbit hole and find out, hey, what's going on? And surprisingly, it's taken things like 9/11 and our latest experiences with the flu to wake a lot of people up. So for whatever reason, the things that are pushing people more towards less freedom also tend to wake them up. So I'm going to just read a little bit. This is from the Constitutional Convention page on Wikipedia. And it says, although the convention was intended to, and this is putting the Constitution in the best possible light that can possibly be done, which is how everything on Wikipedia works. So it's about power and freedom, everything in the world, which is what this entire podcast is about. Although the convention was intended to revise the League of States and first system of government, the League of States and the Articles of Confederation, you've heard of those. Under the Articles of Confederation, the intention from the outset of many of its proponents, chief among them James Madison of Virginia and Alexander Hamilton of New York, was to create a new frame of government rather than fix the existing one. Okay, so they were told, well, let's revise the Articles of Confederation, let's revise the Confederation and the League of States and figure out how to do things better. And with that said, many people were invited to this Constitutional Convention. However, the Constitutional Convention was not set up by the states. You have to understand that. It was not set up because all the states said, hey, we need to, fix it and let's make an official conclave and let's send the people that we choose, as would make sense with any existing form of government, assuming any of those were legitimate in the first place. And we haven't even gotten to Spooner yet, so we'll get there. But that would have made sense, assuming, right? But no, that's not what happened. People called together. They said, well, let's get together and let's have a meeting. Let's talk about how to improve things. And actually, they were lying. They were lying from the outset. It says Hamilton here and Madison were both lying and were not honest about what was going to happen there. And George Washington arguably too. And yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill everyone's sacred cows. All these ideas of the fathers and the framers and all of this is simply not true. When you go back into it, you're going to find a bunch of people who probably were connected to European royalty. Every 42 out of 43 U.S. presidents were descended from King John of England. They were cousins of King George. And I mean, I could have 10 podcasts just about this. The topic is so big, unfortunately, and the deception behind it's so big. So the people who were invited were not necessarily the biggest heroes of all time, or the most famous statesmen in the Americas. If I remember correctly, Patrick Henry was not invited. Let's see who else. I just found a list here of some of the people that you would think should be, but did not show or were not invited. Anyway, yeah. All right. Anyway, a bunch of people weren't invited who you thought should be invited. I mean, like I said, I started doing research, and this just was just going to be gigantic. So anyway, going down the list. So anyway, they were lying about why they were getting together. Once they got together, as we heard, they were locked in this room all day, every day, and forced to come up with a constitution. But there was what was called the Virginia Plan already in the pocket of James Madison, and he pulls it out and starts arguing for it. Well, all these people are at this federal convention, the Philadelphia Convention, the Grand Convention of Philadelphia, which is how it was contemporaneously known, which is very interesting. Okay, the delegates elected George Washington, who was a proponent of a stronger national government, to become president of the convention. The result of the convention was the Constitution, placing the convention among the most significant events in American history. It took place in the old Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall, in Philadelphia, and it was called the Grand Convention at Philadelphia and not the Constitutional Convention. Okay, nor did most of the delegates arrive intending to draft a new constitution. Many assumed that the purpose of the convention was to discuss, and draft improvements to the existing Articles of Confederation, and would not have agreed to participate otherwise. I love this because the actual non-whitewashed truth is coming out to such a sufficient extent, and people are going back to the original documents. Goodness, I didn't want to make this long. It's already 17 minutes. But anyway, they would not have even shown up if they had known that was going to happen, because it was not an official act by the states. The states didn't decide to create a new federal government, which would have made sense, right? Once the convention began, however, most of the delegates, though not all, came to agree in general terms that the goal was to be a new system of government, not simply a revised version of the Articles of Confederation. So the closed door, no notes version of what's going on. There's nothing going out to the public. There's no debates happening outside that room. There's no newspapers or reporters allowed to discuss it at all. There's no public debate or conversation happening about it. In other words, if you think you're creating a new government, which again, who has the right to do that? For other people, you don't. But if you think you are, then aren't you going to at least involve people and have the newspapers talking about the points, or maybe have people vote on the various ideas? Only 39 out of 55 of the people who attended, I think 70 were invited, and 55 showed up and 39 ratified it based upon what I just saw. Or signed it at least, saying, okay, this is what we want to do, even agreed to it. And so this was not a slam dunk, this is what we're going to do, we all believe in this makes fantastic sense. But what you're going to find is once this document came out, there had to be massive pushing and arguing and rhetoric and debate. And as someone said, if you go read the Federalist Papers, you're going to find out that the average farmer in the early 1800s or late 1700s was much more literate than the average high school student is today. Like, the average high school student would read these and not be able to understand them at all. But these things were posted in newspapers, and people understood them, and they were debating them, and they were talking about them. And basically, the Constitution, as it was created, and there's tons and tons of mud and tons of evil, basically. And if you want to go down the rabbit hole, the conspiracy is going to get bigger and bigger the deeper you dig, because as I said before, well, I'm not going to get into that in this one. But yeah, if you keep digging, you're going to find just as much disgustingness in the Constitution as you will in any law that's made ever. As they say, laws are like sausages if you you don't want to see how they're made, right? So, one second. So the Constitution came out, and honestly, it didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of getting ratified. No one agreed to it. No one believed in it comparatively of the states. No one was ready to sign off on it. It was this crazy idea made by these people who had these ideas because why exactly? What is their authority to even propose this? And this is all handled in the Federalist Papers. They talk about all of they go through the Constitution line by line and explain why it's necessary, how the power will never be violated, how the president will never act like a king, how the legislature will never leave their bounds and do anything bad or evil, how the justices are going to of the Supreme Court are going to keep the law and to be moral and very, very noble people who are going to prevent the United States from going into any bad places, and how it's not going to be corrupted, and how, anyway, they talk about that over and over and over, how the states are going to be able to keep the national government in line and all these things. They had, for example, the senators being elected by the state legislatures, for example. So the states had representatives in the federal government instead of just direct elections, and it was never direct elections anyway. It was electors. So much of even what happened in the Constitution, all of the setups that had more checks and balances, and even those have been completely destroyed and invalidated and dug under until they collapse. But they were arguing for it in these Federalist Papers that were coming out, by the way, anonymously, but written by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton again. So they were supposed to be presented as anonymous, just people of the people, just writing what they write because they're reading this document and think, golly gee, this is wonderful, we should do this. But actually, this was being powered by the people who had the most to benefit from the adoption of this new government, which, whatever their plan was, but who all had deep connections, by the way, direct descendants of King John I and cousins of King George, etc. So when they say we're going to do this for ourselves and our posterity, they were speaking literally. And okay, that's just a little tidbit to throw in there. So no one wanted to ratify it, and they would not have ratified it until they came up with the Bill of Rights. And so all of the states said, okay, if you think this is such a great idea, then at least we need a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights needs to hold back the power of this federal government so that in these 10 areas that we're very gun shy about and that we've experienced extraordinary issues with, that the federal government does not go over its bounds. And so once they said, okay, we can do that, we're going to add the Bill of Rights, then it began to become ratified by the states themselves, thus putting themselves under its authority. But here's the problem. Whose job is it to enforce the Bill of Rights? If the federal government says the right of the people to, let me just open these because I am, again, a little out of it today. They don't even print it. Okay, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Have we seen any of that lately? Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, so there's a lot there, right? So we want religion, free exercise of religion, speech, press, assemblage, and petition for redress of grievances. Now, I don't know what you've noticed lately, but it seems in the last couple of years, all of those have been violated in various ways, including, and if we look in Canada, there's some people petitioning pretty intensely now, and there's quite a war going on about it, quite a, it's heating up, and I don't know what the current state is today, but day by day, it's getting more and more intense. Okay, so the problem is, whose job is it to enforce that the government doesn't do these things, right? The government says, okay, we're not going to stop religion or freedom of speech or press or anything else. Then who's going to stop them? They tax you. They have the police. They have the armies. Are you going to stop them? If they say, well, we have a national emergency and unfortunately we're going to engage in massive widespread censorship and or defamation and or silencing and or whatever, then and again, this is now happening on a corporate level. So what you have is called fascism rather than or corporatism rather than just despotism. But all of the rights in the Bill of Rights, as we see, if the government gives, the government can take away. If the state grants you this right because of ink on paper, then the state can take the right away. And they say, well, you know, they can only do that a little bit. You'll take them to court. The court will strike it down. Basically, when the emergency gets big enough, there's an excuse to eliminate every freedom. And just like they went and locked up all the Japanese Americans in California at the beginning of World War II. I mean, that violates all sorts of rights. And yet it was held by the Supreme Court to be legal, taking unlawful searches and seizures, respects of property. All these things have been violated numerous times. The confiscation of gold by citizens of the United States by the federal government. Basically, the Bill of Rights sounds nice, but there's no one to enforce it, right? Because the only power that's enforcing it is the one with all the power and the guns and the tanks. Well, luckily people still have guns, which is the only reason that some of these amendments still get respected in any way. And so if there's no alternative force, I guess you could say the states, maybe, to enforce the freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution, then whatever the federal government decides is law. And now you have really weird situations where the federal government says you can't own a plant. Oh, I wanted to talk about that. The federal government says you can't own a plant. Some states say you do. And so they have this battle going on where people are raising and selling this plant and selling it to people. And then the federal government, interestingly, they're having, and the federal government still can make it illegal and make taxes payable on it, but you can't deduct things. And now there's something weird happening, just as an aside. The police are pulling over armored cars filled with pot money and just taking all the money from a specific company on a specific path, same car every day. Crazy. All right. As far as I know, it's not the federal government, but I think the federal government did recently open up hundreds of, someone had a mailboxes, sort of a safe deposit box location in California, and they just took everything in all the safe deposit boxes and made you prove that anything you owned and any of these safe deposit boxes was gotten legally. And, you know, people had gold in there, people had antiques or cash or whatever. So how are you going to prove that, right? And if not, they're just going to keep it all. So much for searches and seizures, so much for most of these amendments. And because who's going to go to bat for you and try to enforce them? Well, they say, well, you can do it in the courts. Problem is the courts will take a couple years to do this process. So look at the back page people. They take their money and shut down their bank accounts and then run them through a very long court system. They can't protect themselves because all the money has been taken. If it's taken illegally, it's going to take you a couple years of going through the courts to get it back. And how are you going to survive? How are you going to exist? How are you going to keep things going? How are you going to battle this monolith that can, for 2 or 3 years, stonewall you in the court system while it's taking your rights away and attacking you? Really? So the point is, the Constitution was bad enough that no state wanted to ratify it. It was created by deception. It was not wildly popular. It was probably had all these hidden agendas behind it. And even the Bill of Rights cannot be enforced meaningfully in any way. And we're seeing that right now. We're seeing the forces of money and power arrayed against the forces of free speech and alternate ideas. And it's hanging by a thread, right? Because at any moment, this could completely be shut down. And in the name of emergency, in the name of public health, in the name of terrorism, you know, the state always has a reason to say, oh, well, all these rights that you had, actually, you don't have them anymore. And so enough people have been renditioned and taken to Guantanamo and tortured, and or just American citizens murdered outright in foreign countries, bombed and drone striked Anwar Awlaki because they said something that the state didn't like. With no trial, even U.S. citizens and even his 15-year-old son murdered a couple years later by the state. So who's going to avenge them? Who's going to make sure the state isn't taking away your life, liberty, and property? Everyone's too scared. There's no one who can stand up to it. What are you going to do? You know? And if it's taking away rights, okay, you can go to the courts. Well, again, who owns the courts? Who runs the courts? The same people, right? It's not like there's these political insiders and that they're these do-gooders, and then they're going to help you. You know, it's so rare to find that honest politician that when you do, you all celebrate and rally around him. And all these people were so excited about Ron Paul and now Rand Paul. But really, you have one or two people who are possibly supporting you in the federal system where everything else is completely either through corruption or graft or bribery, or they have been extorted via Epstein and that whole structure. So that what can you trust there, if anything at all? Difficult to say, right? So yeah, so a lot of people are now, and this is one beef that I have. A lot of people in the freedom movement are stuck on, well, we just need to be Republicans, and I kind of understand that, and or believe in the Constitution to have freedom, and I kind of understand their argument for that, because they believe that many of them believe the Constitution is divinely inspired, the Bill of Rights is beautiful. It's true, and well, I'm not saying that's true, but the Bill of Rights is a valuable document that has lots of great stuff in it. However, there's no way for you to enforce it. There's no way for you to make it happen under the Constitution. There's no way for you to keep your rights. Once you have created, think of the Ring of Power, Lord of the Rings, once you have created the 800-pound gorilla, and once you've given him ultimate power, and once he has the ultimate police power, and now we have secret police in America, we have the FBI, we have the CIA, we have the NSA, they're listening to everything, they know everything, and you have people just being randomly murdered and then declared as suicide. We have 2-bullet suicide. Gary Webb, all these people stand up and they try to change things or point out that things are being unjust or not done right, and they end up dead and or imprisoned for questioning things, for trying to bring back freedom. And so what are you going to do? It doesn't matter if you have a Bill of Rights, if you have no method to enforce it. It doesn't matter how great the Constitution is if anyone can violate it at any point just by declaring a state of emergency, as we have seen over the last couple of years. So, and then if you look at the founding and creation of the Constitution, as many people thought, oh, this is this noble, great, beautiful document. Well, look at how it was created. Look at who got the power. Look at how they got the power. And look immediately after it was ratified and George Washington was president, look at the Whiskey Rebellion and what he was trying to do. Look at the Alien and Sedition Acts. I mean, they tried to shut down freedom immediately. It's just that the federal government was tiny and weak and didn't have a lot of power. And so if people chose not to obey or not to follow or to even come up in armed resistance against the Constitution, they could develop a resistance and the government couldn't really do anything. Not so today. Now the government, as a giant parasite, has so much power and so much money. In fact, the ability to create money from nothing, which I will talk about at some point. But that what it decides is law, and it can imprison you and or kill you for an infinite amount of time for possessing a plant if it wants, right? And it can release people who are murderers regardless of what the people want, or rapists, to go out and do it again if that's what it decides, without the people being able to do anything about any of this. And so the people sit at the bottom and say, please, please, Mr. Government, don't do these things to me. Don't be evil and bad and dishonest, and don't take away my rights. But that's where they are. They're the state of beggars because they've given their power away. And until people realize that, no, it's not Donald Trump who's going to save you. It's definitely not Biden who's going to save you. It's not anyone who's in a president's chair who's going to save you. In fact, the very idea that you have one guy sitting at the top of the pyramid who's able to handle everything that the federal government has its fingers in at the moment, is patently insane, right? How could he possibly know what's going on with 300 million people and manage it? And the answer is he can't. And there's giant bureaucracies that exist before presidents, after presidents that run these things. And the key is, if you're going to have any structure to society at all, it has to happen on a very local level, and it has to happen consensually. Yes, and what if people don't want to be in that consensual structure? I will talk about that, because lots of people have talked about that, theorized about that, and created solutions for that. But you are never taught any of these solutions. No one ever talks to you about these solutions, because that would undermine this massive monolithic power, which is now focused in nation states, but which, as you saw with COVID, is beginning to be coalesced into one massive unit that all acts in lockstep, which is what they called it, instantly, when it's called to action or activated. So it's getting even worse than that. And so people think, well, let's just go back to the Constitution. You can't. There's no way to go back to the Constitution. The Constitution didn't protect you in the first place. And we're going to have to figure out how to govern ourselves at some point if we want to have freedom. That's the only way to do it. There is no other solution. And if we refuse to do that, then it's going to happen for us and going to happen to us. And that may be what ultimately happens with the crises that seem like they're coming upon us. Anyway, I was sending out quotes every day. I was reading the Federalist Papers, then I tried to read the Anti-Federalist Papers, much less. I mean, the Anti-Federalist Papers don't really exist, and they're much less well organized, because it was obvious because the Federalist Papers had to be written to convince people, and people kind of knew already all the bad ideas about centralizing power and having a focus of all the power for the state. Yeah, I hope I explained that halfway okay. But the point of all this is not to give you the complete A to Z explanation of it, of what I've been studying for 20 years, because I can't. There's just too much information. The point is to give you a little bit of an idea, a little bit of a starting place to start from, to do your own research, to start figuring things out, to start changing the structure of your thoughts, to consider that maybe what you've been taught and what you've been indoctrinated to believe or propagandized to think is true is not actually true, and that there may be better ways out there, and that we can do those ways together. And that is the end of current civilization and dictatorship and the violence that rules. And that is my hope. All right, all my love.